Hey guys, welcome to CraterMania. I'm your host, the man they call Crater, and welcome back to my 500 movies in 2025 series. So this is the second installment now in the CraterMania birthday month favorites series that I am doing. So if you watched the last episode, you know that I covered some of my favorites in popcorn, and I talked about Poltergeist and Rear Window and a couple of Dario Argento films and Suspiria and Phenomena. So tonight that continues with just a series of movies that's also considered my favorites in their own sense, in their own genres, in their own categories. So, before I get into tonight's movies, just want to talk a little bit about my weekend. So it's been kind of crazy, honestly. Some good and some really bad. Um, so let's go ahead and just start with the good, I guess. So this weekend, I had been thinking about doing this for a while now, and it's something that I had never done before. I've got tattoos. Obviously, I got the ghost face. I got Gizmo and Misfits, and uh, I have a Ninja Turtles leg sleeve, and a minor threat tattoo on my foot. And I want to get more tattoos later on, but I did something that I thought about doing for a while. And I was just finally, like talked myself into it. And that is I got a piercing. So I got my ears pierced actually yesterday on Saturday. And so I guess I'll go ahead and show you guys. So there's the one, and so there's the other. And yeah, so this is just something that I didn't think I would ever do. Had just been talking to my wife about it for a while, and she really wanted me to do it as well. Um, and I got to be honest with you, like I said, I'd never had a piercing before. Super nervous going into it, and I don't know why, because it really didn't bother me at all when they done it. And I was like, holy crap, that wasn't so bad after all. And but yeah, so I really like it. I'm considering now even getting maybe another piercing, maybe a septum piercing in my nose. I don't know. I don't really know yet. Something I got to think about. I want to take this slow. Um, but I'm really glad I did it. And then afterwards we went and ate at one of my favorite restaurants, which is Buffalo Wild Wings. Um, First time I ate there in a long time, actually. Um, but and just yesterday was just a really good day. All day was really good. Me and my wife had a great time going out and just, you know, doing everything that we did, and getting my ears pierced, going out to eat, going to Goodwill, and just whatever. Um, but then here's the bad part of it. So late last night, around 11:30 p.m. Eastern time, um, a really good friend of mine that I've known for many, 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 many years, um, probably close to 20 years. He passed away last night, and his name is Brad Centers, and he was a genuinely good-hearted guy. Was always good to me. Um, just I knew so many people in my community that loved Brad. Um, he fought a really long battle with cancer, and just unfortunately, um, last night he couldn't fight anymore. But he fought it long and hard. He fought that thing tooth and nail. And I am proud to say that Brad was my friend, and I'm really going to miss him. Next few days is definitely going to be hard for his family and a lot of his really close friends, and just people that was within our kind of local music community over the past 20 years. Um, Brad, I just I love you, man, and I wish you. I honestly, I wish you were still here with us. But I know that one day I'll see you again, brother. So I want to just dedicate tonight's episode actually to the memory of my good friend Brad Centers, and but yeah, so just a very interesting weekend, and but and unfortunately, I won't be able to attend his funeral on Tuesday, just because of work and just this mandatory training that I'm going through right now at work, where they don't want you to miss any days during the training. So that sucks, but I do send all my love to Brad, his friends, his family that will be in attendance for his funeral. I pray that you guys, find peace within that. And yeah, so yeah, I just sorry guys. I just wanted to mention that really quick, just because, like I said, Brad was a really good friend to me, and met Brad through another friend when I went to an Old Crow Medicine Show concert years and years ago, and Brad, for some reason, some random reason, he started calling me Knuckles that night, and I just thought that was hilarious. It was just out of nowhere, and but if you knew Brad, that's just how he was, and just a very very kind hearted dude, and he would call me that. He was the only person that would call me that. He would call me that for years and years after that, but just yeah, once again, I love Brad. I'm gonna miss you, brother, and just hope to see you again. But I guess I will now jump in to tonight's show, where I'm gonna be talking about the movies. So like I said, this is in the 500 movies in 2025 that I'm just moving right along, and getting closer and closer to that 500. So for tonight's episode, this will be movies number 328 through 333. And I guess I'll go ahead and start with the first movie. So in the world of horror cinema, the name Wes Craven is like the Mount Olympus. He's part of that Mount Rushmore of horror directors, 100% without a doubt. And for most people, his when you think of Wes Craven, you think of really two genre defining figures. You have Freddy Krueger, and who is that razor glove demon, of our collective subconscious from A Nightmare on Elm Street. And then you have Ghostface, who, this meta slasher who taught this generation the rules of horror films in the movie Scream. And these are undeniable classics. They're brilliant films, that just rewired that DNA of, just of the genre. And I adore them. I definitely adore, Freddy and Ghostface and just, Nightmare on Elm Street, Scream and all that. Um, I revere them, but they are not, for me, my the purest distillation of Wes Craven's, singular genius. And to find that, you have to kind of descend into the basement of his filmography, and just to navigate these booby trapped hallways of his creativity, and just and you have to discover one of the most feral masterpieces within his filmography, and that is my favorite Wes Craven film, 1991's The People Under the Stairs. And it's a film that, upon first glance, feels like this chaotic fever dream. It's this, this Molotov cocktail of genres, a brutal home invasion thriller, a dark fairy tale, a biting social satire, and just this high stakes, adventure film that's just all rolled into one. It's messy, it's loud, and just It's just unapologetically strange, and I think that is precisely why it's just this unparalleled brilliance. Um, and so at its core, the film is this twisted take on Hansel and Gretel. Pretty much that it's set in this kind of inner city ghetto, if you will. So our hero here is Poindexter Williams, who, this young boy whose nickname is Fool, and Fool's family is facing eviction. His mother's dying of cancer. Um, they're broke. They're poor. And their landlords, who are these just impossibly wealthy and notoriously cruel, um, people named the Robinsons. They own this entire neighborhood and are just systematically kind of driving out all these poor people to make way for these new developments. So Fool, he gets desperate. He's convinced by this local hustler to break into the Robinsons fortress, like kind of like mansion, to steal this what is a rumored collection of rare gold coins. Um, so what Fool discovers inside is not just a house, but a living, breathing nightmare. And so the windows are barred, the doors are locked with deadbolts from the inside, and just the entire structure is a labyrinth of secret passages, electrified doors and or and not electrified, but just electrified like walls and the floors and all that, and just these pressure plates, and the house is ruled by this deranged incestuous couple who's known only as mommy and daddy, played by Wendy Roby and Everett McGill. So they are kind of these really grotesque caricatures of the American dream, wealthy, religious, and utterly psychotic. They patrol their home with a shotgun and this vicious Rottweiler, named Prince, by the way, and they're just punishing any perceived transgression with just this sadistic glee about it. Um, but the true horror lies in what they're keeping locked away. So trapped within the walls and cellar is this group of these pale, mutilated boys. These stolen children who failed to live up to mommy and daddy's impossible standards of being that perfect child. Um, and these are the people under the stairs. And they're cannibalized and tormented. And they're now living like these feral creatures in the dark. And Fool's mission quickly shifts from robbery to survival as he starts to team up with this girl Alice, who is the Robinson's abused daughter, and then there's Roach, who is this brave tongueless boy who navigates all these secret passages, to fight back against their, you know, these monstrous people who have captured them and just to escape this house of horrors. So, to understand why this film works so magnificently, you must understand that its creator, Wes Craven, wasn't just a horror director. He was an academic, a philosopher, just this fearless social critic who used the genre as his scalpel. And before he ever picked up a camera, he earned a master's degree in philosophy and writing from John Hopkins University. His early works, like, The Last House on the Left from 1972, Hills Have Eyes from 1977, they were both very raw, just angry responses to the violence, of the Vietnam era, exploring just that kind of thin veneer of civilization and what happens, when it's stripped away. Um, but and just with A Nightmare on Elm Street from 1984, he graduated from that raw realism to this kind of surrealist terror, just kind of tapping into that Freudian idea that the most potent horrors are the ones that are born from our own minds. And then with Scream in 1996, he deconstructed that very genre that he helped build, and he created this film that was both this terrifying slasher and this brilliant commentary on all these different horror themes. And but with The People Under the Stairs, it just sits kind of perfectly in the middle, of this whole creative evolution. Arguably representing Craven at his most unleashed. It contains that kind of raw social fury, of his early films, and that kind of clever, almost playful deconstruction that would, define his later work. And here, he wasn't just exploring a theme; he was throwing every single one of his obsessions into this blender and just hitting puree. The result is just this kind of unholy concoction that is just really uniquely and unmistakably Wes Craven. Um, and what elevates The People Under the Stairs from this mere cult classic to this kind of a prophetic masterpiece is it's very ferocious social commentary. It was released in 1991. um the film is just this direct indictment of the Reaganomics and the widening class divide in America. And the Robinsons are this ultimate kind of one percenters. They're these slumlords who have just built their fortune by exploiting the poor people, and literally just hoarding their wealth within the walls of their home, while this community outside is suffering. Um, and their house is just this kind of this broken, almost like a broken capitalist system. This fortified prison where the rich live in this kind of opulent decay. You know, just fed by the suffering of this underclass that they keep locked in their basement. Um, and there's like all these racial undertones. They're just as potent and deliberate here as well. Our hero Fool is this young, intelligent black boy, fighting for survival, against this kind of monstrous, hyper violent, white establishment. So that the Robinsons are just obsessed with purity and seeking the perfect white children, and just discarding or mutilating any who disappoint them. So, this isn't subtext, it's just kind of blaring call, about, systematic racism and, gentrification and just the kind of violence, it's inherent in a system that really devalues, black lives. So the film's really, cathartic climax, where Fool unleashes, the hoarded gold coins, and the money literally just rains down on this, cheering neighborhood, is this kind of revolutionary fantasy. It's this powerful image of wealth, redistribution that just feels more urgent today than it did, 3 decades ago. Um, and I think this is the film's, enduring legacy. Is long before Jordan Peele, masterfully, blended horror with, social commentary and Get Out and Us. Wes Craven was doing it with with a sledgehammer. With the people under the stairs is just that spiritual ancestor, I think, to modern um, socially conscious horror. It proved that a film could be simultaneously terrifying and hilarious and just politically radical. The tonal shifts that might baffle some viewers are in fact, I think, the film's greatest strengths. Um, so one moment you're watching Daddy, clad in this full leather gimp suit, blast through these walls with a shotgun, and it's kind of a scene of pure relentless terror. And then the next, you're laughing just at the absurdity, of his, ridiculous one-liners. This kind of prevents the film from becoming, preachy or overly grim. You know what I mean? And instead, it kind of weaponizes, that absurdity to make its points, and just creating this kind of unique fairy tale. This fairy tale logic, I guess you could say, where like the grotesque and the comedic coexist. And I love that. That's why it's one of my absolute favorites. It's my favorite Wes Craven film because like it's so much like rolled into one, like I said earlier. And in conclusion, I guess, A Nightmare on Elm Street, gave us an icon. Scream, gave us the rule book. But People Under the Stairs gave us Wes Craven's heart and rage and just that untamed imagination, just all at once. And, it's a film that just, I think, refuses to be categorized, if you know what I mean. Like, it's this kind of primal scream against injustice, kind of wrapped in this disguise of a B movie monster mash. Um, but it's a story about this brave boy who refuses to be a victim, who ventures basically into this nightmare, not just to steal its gold, but just to burn that whole rotten structure to the ground and to free its prisoners. And for me as a lifelong fan of this movie, this is the film where all of Wes Craven's kind of thematic threads converge. Just the breakdown of that nuclear family, that the horror lurking beneath the suburban normalcy, and just that battle between the disenfranchised and that corrupt establishment. It's all here. It's cranked up to 11. Um, but more importantly, I think it's one of Wes Craven's most hopeful films. Unlike there's kind of these bleak endings, of many of his other films. Um, Fool doesn't just survive; he triumphs. He becomes a hero to his community. It's this spirit, of that kind of righteous rebellion. I think that just makes this film so endlessly rewatchable and inspiring. The People Under the Stairs is is not just my favorite Wes Craven movie. It is, in my estimation, his most daring and his most personal and just his most, you know, just prescient work. You know what I mean? It's just a cinematic fun house. It's built by this mad genius, and I'll gladly get lost, in that movie. And it's terrifying, it's brilliant, and just it's deeply meaningful, you know. Yeah, like I said, I will get lost in that movie for the rest of my days. So if you've never seen The People Under the Stairs, please don't waste any more time. Get on that ASAP and watch People Under the Stairs. Hmm. Hey, Dana. So we got Dana from Deadites on Deck in here. So appreciate you stopping by, Dana. Um, so that's People Under the Stairs. But let me go ahead and move on to the next movie that I'm going to be talking about tonight. So this next movie, I feel like this is a movie that does not get talked about a whole lot by anybody that I know, at least. I think that I've heard Dana talk about this movie. Um, at one point. I think me and her have actually discussed it on her channel. By the way, if you are not subscribed to Dead Outs on Deck, Evil Dead Chick, go over and check her out for sure. Puts out good stuff every week that you guys will be sure to love. But like I said, this next movie I'm going to be talking about, I think me and her have talked about it at least once or twice on her channel. Um, and so you can ask any Clint Eastwood fan, to name his, definitive film, and you'll get, a familiar list of these kind of cinematic titans. Like, for some, it's that the man with no name in the good, the bad, and the ugly. For others, it's the righteous, rule breaking fury of Harry Callahan and Dirty Harry. Um, and then you got for the modern cinephiles out there, it's that haunting kind of revisionist western, Unforgiven, or even the heartbreaking tragedy of Million Dollar Baby. And all those movies are definitely classics. Just cornerstones of Clint Eastwood's legendary career. But for my money, I think the single greatest film to bear Clint Eastwood's name, the one that is most daring, most personal, and just most terrifyingly effective, is his very first outing as a director. And this is the 1971 thriller Play Misty for Me. It's a film that on the surface seems like a minor entry, in this kind of filmography of giants. It's a low budget thriller made just at the height of his, international stardom. It was a project that, he had to fight Universal Pictures to direct himself. Yet, in that fight and in the film itself, we see the blueprint for the artist that Eastwood would become. It's a raw, just unsettling, and just brilliantly crafted piece of work that not only launched one of Hollywood's most celebrated, directorial careers, but just also created this kind of entire subgenre of film that just continues to thrill and terrify audiences to this day. Um, and at its heart, Play Misty for Me is just this chillingly simple story about a casual mistake with just horrifying consequences. Um, so Clint Eastwood plays Dave Guyver, who's this smooth talking, popular jazz DJ in this kind of coastal town of Carmel, California, I think is the name of the town. But his life is just one of this kind of comfortable routine. He hosts his late night radio show. He's quoting poetry. He frequents his favorite jazz clubs and kind of maintains this complicated on again, off again relationship with his girlfriend. Um, and just every night his show is kind of punctuated by this sultry recurring request from this female caller where she says, "Play Misty for me." And one night, at his this local little restaurant he goes to, um, Dave was like restaurant slash bar. He's picked up by this woman named Evelyn, Evelyn Draper, and she's played by Jessica Walter. And she's charming, forward, just reveals herself to be this mysteriously, nightly caller. And what begins, as this kind of seemingly, harmless one night stand, this no strings attached encounter for, that commitment phobic Dave, it quickly spirals, into this nightmare. And Evelyn is not just a fan. She is this, obsessive, just dangerously unstable stalker. And her initial just romantic, overtures kind of curdle into the possessiveness and then paranoia and finally into this just psychotic, violent rage. And Dave's attempts to kind of gently disengage, you know, just really only tighten her grip. And just his entire life, his career, his home, and just the lives of those he loves. Is just he's systematically targeted and just torn apart by this woman whose love is just indistinguishable from pure destructive hatred. um, and just the scenic beauty of that town, Carmel, with its kind of the misty coastlines and that kind of vibrant, Monterey Jazz Festival that's going on. It really becomes this very claustrophobic trap. Um, like this kind of sun-drenched paradise that's transformed into this private hell of our main character here. Um, and like I said, the most remarkable fact about Play Misty for me is that it stands as Clint Eastwood's directorial debut. So back in 1971, Clint Eastwood was arguably the biggest movie star in the world at this time. I mean, he was just the embodiment of that masculine, cool guy, and he's invincible pretty much, and just he's always in control with all of his characters. He could have easily chosen this, a surefire commercial hit, for his first film, like a western or an action flick, that kind of played to his, established personas. But instead, he chose this, this really small scale, character driven, psychological thriller where his character is not the hero but is the victim. Um, and just the decision with that is just the key, I think, to the film's brilliance. Eastwood, as the director, just fundamentally deconstructs Eastwood, the star. So, as Dave Garver, he's vulnerable and careless and just kind of frequently terrified. He makes this kind of foolish, selfish mistake and just spends the rest of the film paying this brutal price for it. He's not a gunslinger, riding in to save the day. He's just a regular guy, completely out of his depth, being hunted by, this force that he cannot comprehend or control. You know, it 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 was an incredibly brave choice, I think, in kind of stripping away that armor, of his on-screen mythology that he had established at this time to just kind of reveal a very flawed, frightened, human being. And in his direction, which was I think was clearly influenced by his mentors Don Siegel, who actually has a cameo in this as the bartender Murphy, and also Sergio Leone. It was another influence to him. And he's really lean, efficient, just ruthlessly effective with his filmmaking. There is no wasted motion within this. Eastwood just kind of allows the camera to linger on, Jessica Walter's face, just kind of capturing every subtle shift from seductive vulnerability to that terrifying, psychosis. And he just uses that natural beauty, the Carmel locations to create this very stark contrast with just this kind of ugly, encroaching horror. You know what I mean? Like, so the famous scene, intercutting a beautiful romantic montage of Dave and his girlfriend with Evelyn's very frenzied knife wielding destruction of his living room, and his housekeeper is just kind of this master stroke of editing and suspense. And it's the work not of a novice, definitely. I mean, but of a born filmmaker with this kind of understanding of tension and just visual storytelling. um and it's not an exaggeration to say that Play Misty for me is the grandfather of the modern stalker thriller. I mean, its DNA is present in nearly every film, of its kind that followed. Before Play Misty for me, horror kind of often came from supernatural ghouls or, mass slashers or whatever. Um, this film located, terror in just that terrifyingly plausible. The stranger you bring home, the fan whose admiration sours into obsession. And I think its most famous cinematic descendant is of course Fatal Attraction, which I think Dana mentioned in the chat here. Um, just the parallels with it are undeniable. You have this successful man who is a casual affair, finds himself just relentlessly pursued by this unhinged woman. But where Fatal Attraction became this kind of cultural phenomenon with Play Misty for me is arguably that more raw and more grounded and just more, you know, terrifyingly original in my opinion. Um, you know, Jessica Walters, Evelyn Draper character is not just a caricature of this scorned woman. She is just this kind of deeply, pathetic and frighteningly real portrait of severe mental illness. And just her performance is nothing short of iconic here. She infuses Evelyn with just a tragic fragility that makes her very monstrous actions all the more unsettling. You see this desperate loneliness, behind her eyes, and right before she explodes into all this violence. And it's a performance that's so powerful. I think it's reportedly, it reportedly typecast her for years, which is, I think, is a testament to just how completely she embodied that role. Um, and the film itself's impact also kind of lies in its, that subversion of gender roles, just in this kind of era where on-screen women were often relegated to damsels in distress or whatever. The character Evelyn Draper is the film's active, terrifying antagonist or villain. She is the predator, and that towering figure of Clint Eastwood is her prey. And this dynamic, was revolutionary for its time and just really adds this layer, that psychological discomfort that still feels potent today. So, the film forces, a male protagonist, and by extension, a predominantly male audience to experience a type of fear, being stalked and harassed and, just physically overpowered. That was and just often still is, primarily associated with the female experience. But I guess just to kind of wrap this up, while I'll always cheer, um, when Blondie outsmarts Tuco, or when Harry Callahan delivers an iconic one liner, Play Misty for me. Just it really occupies a special revered place in my appreciation for Clint Eastwood. It is the film where an actor, secure, in his stardom, took this tremendous risk to prove that he was an artist. He chose a story that challenged his image and just showcased this kind of phenomenal performance, from his female co-star, and just really explored this very dark, uncomfortable corner of the human psyche. This film is more than just a well-made thriller. It is a landmark of just suspense cinema, a very bold, directorial statement, and just a showcase, for one of the, I think, the most terrifying, screen performances of all time, in the character Evelyn Draper. It gets under your skin, and it really it feels like it stays there for a long time after you watch this movie. Just kind of it becomes this kind of haunting, almost melody that you can't get out of your head. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the most profound horrors don't lurk in the shadows, but just kind of walk right up to you in a crowded bar and and ask for a song or whatever. Um, you know, for its bravery, its artistry, and it's just that raw, unrelenting power. Play Misty for me is is not just my favorite Clint Eastwood movie. I believe it is his finest. I know that's a very bold statement, but I mean, it's totally different from anything else he has ever done, and I absolutely love it, and I highly recommend it. If you've never seen Play Misty for Me, definitely check it out. Um, but that brings me to the next movie on this list. So this next movie, so I'm a huge sci-fi guy. I mean, people know that I love horror. People know that I love wrestling and just I love comedy. Um, but I'm a huge sci-fi guy too. And so in the kind of hallowed halls of sci-fi cinema, there's titans that command universal respect, like the Star Wars series, like Blade Runner, 2001: A Space Odyssey, the Alien franchise. They're all undisputed royalty when it comes to sci-fi. Um, their influence kind of just etched into that very DNA of the genre. Um, but for some people, me specifically, who kind of spent my formative years, um, watching all these movies on VHS and movies on TV and all that, and just I just where I would always was lurking the aisles of the local video store. You know, my loyalty lies with a different kind of sci-fi film. Um, And for me, that is and probably always will be the Guyver from 1991. The Guyver is a film that just, really defies that cynical criticism, just this pure, unadulterated blast of just creative energy that just, represents that zenith of a very specific and now um, you know, sadly gone now in your era of filmmaking. It's not just my favorite sci-fi movie. I think this movie was a testament to just the power of practical effects and just that that sheer unbridled joy of monster making. Um, so the Guyver is the story of Sean Barker, played by Jack Armstrong, who is this, he's a directionless but just good-hearted college student and karate enthusiast, and his life is just a simple loop of training, pining after his friend Misty, and just generally being this unassuming protagonist of the story. That all changes when he stumbles upon this mysterious metal case that was kind of like lost in the mix amongst this battle at the Kronos Corporation. And inside is the unit, which is his alien device, of just unknown origin. So in this moment, of accidental activation, the unit latches onto him and this is like in the scene where he's getting mugged by this gang in this back alley. Um, and it just kind of and in this kind of sequence of just terrifying and exhilarating body horror, it symbiotically bonds with his very being. So it unfurls and just envelops him and just transforms him into this this biomechanical super soldier known as the Guyver. And this is where the film truly takes off. So the Guyver, it isn't just a suit; it's like this living weapon. It grants Sean this superhuman strength and agility, and just this kind of formidable arsenal of organic weaponry. Including this, these retractable vibranium arm blades, and just this powerful gravity orb, called the Mega Smasher that's in his chest, and this head, this head mounted laser. But with this great power comes this terrifying new reality. The the Kronos Corporation, who's led by Fulton Balkus, who's played by David Gale, is not just a mere tech company. It's a front for this, these ancient alien shapeshifters known as the Zoonoids, who can transform from their human form into this kind of grotesque, powerful monsters. And they created the Guyver unit, and basically will now stop at nothing just to get it back. Um, what follows this is not, a complex narrative of, a political intrigue or, philosophical debate or anything. It is just this very visceral, beautifully straightforward tale of just this young guy, fighting tooth and nail against this army of monsters just to protect his friends and, by extension, the world. So, we're introduced at this point to this CIA agent, Max Reed, who is, played with this kind of world weary charm by the legendary Mark Hamill, um, also known as Luke Skywalker from the Star Wars series. And, and he's been investigating, Kronos, and he kind of serves as this early mentor figure. So the movie, just barrels forward with this kind of monster of the week intensity, as Sean is just a force to battle progressively more and more terrifying zoonoids, each with them with kind of a unique and very lovingly crafted design by the effects team here. From Lisker to MC Striker, every creature is this masterpiece of just practical creature design. Just a symphony of latex and animatronics, and just um, it's phenomenal. And to understand why the Guyver looks and feels the way it does, you only need to look at it. Its directors here. You got Screaming Mad George and Steve Wayne. These aren't your typical Hollywood filmmakers. These guys are special effects wizards and creature creators and just monster makers of the highest caliber at this time. Their backgrounds weren't in telling these nuanced human stories. And their expertise was in pulling nightmares into reality. And Screaming Mad George is just a legend, in the world of surreal and grotesque, practical effects. His work on films like A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 and 4, most notably Freddy's infamous Chest of Souls, and then Poltergeist 2, and then Brian Yuzna's masterpiece, if you want to call it a masterpiece, Society. It's all defined by this nightmarish, organic, and just often disturbing quality. You know, he brought that unique, almost psychotropic sensibility to the Guyver, and just ensuring that the zoonoid transformations were not clean or cool, but just messy and painful and visceral as can be. You can feel his touch in the way the skin splits and tears, and just revealing that monstrous flesh beneath. And then you have Steve Wang on the other hand. He's a master of creature suit design and action, and he was one of the key artists who brought the hunter, in or the predator, to you brought the predator to life, and just worked on just the one of my favorite movies of all time, The Monster Squad. His talent lies in creating suits that are not only visually stunning, but just also functional for dynamic action sequences. He would later go on to direct the sequel, which I'll be talking about here in just a moment, Guyver Dark Hero, which is a film is beloved by a lot of fans of the original as well, for its kind of darker tone and just more faithful adaptation of the source manga. Um, so the collaboration of these two effects geniuses is the very heart of the Guyver. The film is their love letter to the craft. It's a movie directed not from a writer's or an actor's perspective, but from the perspective of the artist who built its world. You know, every shot seems designed to showcase a brilliant creature effect. This grotesque transformation, or this stunningly kind of intricate design of the Guyver suit itself. And the plot serves the monsters, not the other way around. And for a fan like me, that is a feature, not a bug. You know what I mean? But the Guyver was released in 1991, and this was a pivotal moment, I think, in cinematic history. It stood at just the beginning of the whole digital revolution. Just 2 years before Jurassic Park, would change the special effects landscape forever. And as such, it feels like one of the last great, hurrahs of the practical effects driven creature feature. There is a weight, a tangibility to every monster on screen that even the best CGI today often struggles to replicate. When the Guyver punches a Zoonoid, you feel that impact. When a creature bleeds, it's kind of that fluorescent goo or whatever. It feels wet and sticky. That whole physical presence is really what gives the film its enduring charm. Its legacy is that of a quintessential cult classic. It was never a box office smash, but it found its true home on VHS and on TV as well. Because that's actually where I first ever watched it, was on the Sci Fi channel years ago when I was a kid. They would show it, and then they would also show the Guyver 2, Dark Hero, as well. So back to back on the side, and they would do this plenty of times, all the time on Sci-Fi Channel. And I would, every single time they would be on there, I would watch them. And for a generation of kids and teenagers, discovering the Guyver was like a rite of passage. All my friends, I was, if they hadn't seen it, I was always telling about it at school. So I was trying to get them to watch it. And for me, it was a gateway film. Just bridging that gap between American B movies and that Japanese kind of tokusatsu genre, like Kamen Rider or Super Sentai. Just from which its source material just drew inspiration. And for many Western viewers, this was the first taste of the transforming hero theme that was just so prevalent, in Japan. Um, and then there's the whole Mark Hamill factor. I've not talked enough about that yet. So just seeing the actor that was best known as this heroic Luke Skywalker, get captured and forcibly transformed into this giant, insectoid zoonoid is just one of the most wonderfully bizarre and unforgettable moments, I think, in 90s sci-fi cinema. Um, it's this kind of shocking, audacious move that just instantly, seared the film into the minds of its audience. This moment alone just guaranteed, conversations, at school or in comic book shops for years, I feel, and the film and its more, action oriented sequel, fostered this small but, you know, fiercely loyal fan base. It just continues to celebrate, that unique blend of sci-fi and horror and martial arts, action just to this very day. Um, but I guess, in conclusion, is the Guyver a perfect film by traditional critical standards? Probably not. But the dialogue can be cheesy. The acting is earnest in a way that feels distinctly of its time, and just the plot is as subtle as a punch to the face from this from a 7 foot tall rhinoceros monster. um but to judge it on those terms, I think, is to miss the point entirely with this film. The Guyver is a work of art, I think is crafted by artists whose medium was latex and animatronics, and it's a celebration of creativity, a showcase of what was possible when imagination was limited only by physical materials, not that processing power or whatever. It's just a pure, unpretentious and just endlessly entertaining film that just delivers exactly what it promises. And that's a guy in this cool bio armor suit fighting these spectacularly designed monsters. Um, and just now in an age of slick, often soulless CGI blockbusters, that raw kind of handcrafted passion of the Guyver feels more vital and thrilling than ever, in my opinion. It's a beautiful, grotesque, and just deeply human work of monster art, and that is why I think it will forever hold that title of my favorite sci-fi film. So if you've not seen The Guyver, definitely check it out, and definitely check out the next movie we'll be talking about, which is the sequel to The Guyver, and that's Guyver 2 Dark Hero. Before I get into that, let me go ahead and get a drink real quick. All right. You guys like my Mickey Mouse cup? Heck yeah, man. But yeah, so that brings me now to the next movie. And like I said, as a long time Guyver fan, aficionado, whatever, my journey with the franchise began, you know, like many others that are fans of this franchise, that and that was with the original film, that we just talked about, and and then there's also there's some people out there that may have known about the original manga before the films were released, but for me it was I became a fan of this franchise with that first movie, you know, and just in that whole world of that biomechanical horror and cosmic mysteries and just that brutal combat that felt leagues ahead of its time. So that first live action film from 1991 was just that feeling of was a mixture of excitement and trepidation with that and what we got was fun. It was a campy, goofy monster of the week type film starring Mark Hamill as this man who turns into a giant cockroach at the end. Um, and while entertaining in its own right, it was a far cry from the dark, serious tone of the source material in the manga. It was a Guyver movie for people who didn't know what Guyver was. But then in 1994, a miracle happened, sort of. So this direct to video sequel appeared, almost out of nowhere, titled Guyver 2 Dark Hero. And, just with a new lead actor and, drastically different approach, it wasn't just a sequel, it was this kind of profound course correction. It was the film that fans of the manga had been craving, just a dark, gritty, and just astonishingly, faithful adaptation that treated the lore with, the reverence that it deserved. And for me, and just for a legion of cult film enthusiasts, Guyver 2 Dark Hero is is almost the superior film. Even though like I personally I love the first film the best, but I mean, you know, unbiasedly, Guyver 2 Dark Hero is probably the better film. Uh, it's that kind of definitive live action, Guyver experience, and just this kind of masterclass in passionate, low budget filmmaking. Um, so Guyver 2, Dark Hero, it picks up a year after the first film's events, but it immediately establishes its own identity. So Sean Barker, who's now played by this very intense and brooding David Hayter, who's yes is the was would become the future voice of Solid Snake in the Metal Gear Solid games. So Sean is no longer this quippy college kid. He's a haunted man. Just plagued by these nightmares of the Guyver. And the Guyver unit's kind of alien creators and the monstrous Zoanoids and that he's forced to fight. So he lives in isolation, using his that bio boosted armor to wage kind of a one man war on crime. But he yearns for this way to remove this parasitic unit that's bonded to his body. Um, so his quest ends up leading him to this archaeological dig in the Utah mountains where this ancient, alien starship, which is the very same kind that's seen in the manga's flashbacks, has been unearthed. And this discovery has, of course, attracted the attention of the sinister Kronos Corporation. So, and who is the kind of global conglomerate responsible for creating these zoonoids. So at the dig site, Sean finds a potential ally in Corey, who is this determined archaeologist and just a and then there's this new threat in Marcus Cray, which is Kronos's lead security enforcer. So the film's narrative is this kind of B movie plot, on the surface, but it's executed just with like a sci-fi epic, and it just delves deep into the Guyver lore, touching upon the creators, the purpose of the Guyver units as a kind of a spacefaring armor, and just the genetic origins of humanity itself. And what truly sets Dark Hero apart, is its tone. That the campiness is gone. It's replaced by a more noir like atmosphere of dread and alienation. Sean's transformation into the Guyver is portrayed not as a triumphant power up, but as this painful, agonizing process. Um, the suit is like a curse, as much as it is a gift. You know, um, and it's a which is a kind of a thematic um ongoing thing within the manga, and just the action sequences is just a world away, from the rubbery brawls of the first film. Here the combat is fast and brutal and just, beautifully choreographed. We see the Guyver, use his iconic weapons that, the high frequency elbow blades, the head mounted laser, the um just that the devastating mega smasher within his chest, just with lethal precision. The fights are grounded in martial arts, making every blow feel impactful and just every victory feel earned. You know what I mean? Um, and just the practical effects for the zoonoids are grotesque and impressive. Just culminating in this kind of amazing final battle against this genetically engineered Guyver zoonoid, which is a creature of just pure nightmare fuel that feels ripped straight from the manga's pages. So to understand why Dark Hero succeeds where its predecessor stumbled, you know, in some people's eyes, I don't really see it that way, but you know what I mean. You have to look no further than its director though, Steve Wang. So Steve Wang said we talked about him a little bit already, but he's not just a filmmaker. He's that legendary creature effects artist. Just and a stunt man and just and a martial artist. And like I said, his resume includes works on iconic films like Predator, Monster Squad, Gremlins 2. Um, which are all films that I have talked about here in the past on the channel. Um, but crucially, Steve Wang is also a massive Guyver fan. Like I said, he co-directed the first film, but his creative control was limited. So for the sequel, he was just basically given the reins, and his passion for that source material just shines through in every frame of the sequel. Um, and his kind of deep understanding, of creature design and just practical effects is really the film's greatest asset. The Guyver suit itself is a work of art. It's more sleek, more organic, and just far more imposing, I think, than the version in the first movie. Um, Although the first movie suit looks amazing as well. So, but the Zoanoids are varied and just kind of terrifying, with each transformation sequence showcasing this kind of level of practical artistry that's rarely seen in direct to video features. Um, but Steve Wang's talent extends beyond effects. So as a martial artist, he brought a level of that kind of kinetic energy and authenticity to the fight scenes that was just completely absent before. Um, but even though, like I said, and it probably seems like I'm downing the original film, but where I love the original film more than I do this one. But I just feel like this one is just like on a different level, like I was saying, because it's more true to the original source in the manga. You know what I mean? But Steve Wang, he understood that the Guyver is a weapon in this film, and he filmed its movements with just kind of this raw, visceral intensity. Um, and it was just this was a project that was just born of love, and instead of just a studio mandated product, Dark Hero feels like a fan's ultimate tribute. So, Steve Wang, he knew which elements of the lore were most important. The mystery of the creators, just the inner conflict of the host, just and that kind of sheer brutality of the Zoanoids. So, by focusing on these core things, he crafted this film that despite its kind of modest budget, it feels more epic, and just emotionally resonant than action blockbusters with 10 times the resources. You know what I'm saying? Like, but Guyver 2 Dark Hero it was never a box office smash. It found its audience on on video store shelves and through kind of late night cable broadcasts, like I said, on Sci Fi Channel. But yet, its legacy has grown, exponentially over the years, and it really has solidified its status, as this kind of quintessential cult classic. For fans of practical effects, yeah, I just think it stands as a very huge, shining example of the craft in that pre CGI, heyday. The intricate suit work and the creature designs really hold up to this day remarkably well. And it's just a testament to Steve Wang and his whole team's incredible talent. Um, but more importantly, it is often held up as one of the few truly successful live action anime slash manga adaptations of that era. At a time when Hollywood was just consistently failing to understand these foreign properties. Dark Hero proved that fidelity and respect for the source material were the keys to success. It didn't try to Americanize or whatever just those core concepts. It just embraced them wholeheartedly. And the film's impact is also felt in that kind of bittersweet sense of unfulfilled potential. The ending leaves Sean Barker walking towards the alien ship, ready to take the fight to the creators across the galaxy. So it was a perfect setup, for a third film that would have explored, the cosmic scale of the whole Guyver saga. And for decades, fans have dreamed of a Guyver 3 directed by Steve Wang. It's a dream that seems less likely with each passing year. I mean, honestly, I don't think we're ever going to get a Guyver 3 now. But, this kind of lingering what if has only just amplified that love for Dark Hero. Um, it represents that peak of what live action Guyver could be. A just a high watermark that has yet to be surpassed. I feel, you know, um, furthermore, the film serves as a fantastic, early showcase for David Hayter, whose portrayal of this tortured hero Sean Barker just contains echoes of that iconic voice performance that he would later deliver as Solid Snake, in the Metal Gear Solid series. Um, but I guess in conclusion, Guyver 2 Dark Hero is more than just a sequel. It is a redemption. It's a film that took that campy foundation of its predecessor and just rebuilt it into a dark, serious, and thrilling sci-fi action epic. It's a love letter to Yoshiki Takawa's creation, which is crafted by a director who just understood its soul. From David Hayter's like tormented performance to all the stunning practical effects, and all the martial arts. Every element works in works together to create this experience that is both faithful to its roots and just a fantastic film, I think, in its own right. For any fan of the Guyver, or for anyone who just appreciates the artistry of practical effects and just that passionate, unfiltered filmmaking, Guyver 2 Dark Hero is not just recommended viewing, I think it is essential. It remains to this day, the cinematic hero that we Guyver fans deserved. So that's why I covered both Guyver and Guyver 2. So Guyver, technically the first film, is my favorite sci-fi movie of all time. But I also put Guyver 2 Dark Hero right there with it because it's just a continuing story. And I know that's not exactly how it should work, but they're just like they're both the same story, but they're both very different films. So I see them equally as my favorite sci-fi movies of all time. So, and that's why I covered both of them. But that brings me to the next movie on this list. And, of all the strange and just wonderful, portals that I've peered through, in my life as a film lover, um, there are very few that remain as very vivid and alluring and just just delightfully bizarre as the one that opens into Jim Henson's 1986 masterpiece, Labyrinth. And as a lifelong fan of Jim Henson's genius, from the just the anarchic joy of the Muppet Show to to Fraggle Rock, I've always held a special place for his work. You know, but while Dark Crystal is a stunning piece of high fantasy, it is Labyrinth, my favorite of his non-Muppet films that just captured, not just my imagination, but really my very soul. Like I love all of these characters in this movie so much. It's a film that just perfectly braids together, Jim Henson's kind of unparalleled, puppetry and just, the kind of the otherworldly charisma of David Bowie and just this kind of profound coming of age story that really resonates just as powerfully today as it did decades ago. It's more than just a movie. It's this kind of formative experience, a fever dream, that's set to this kind of perfect synth pop beat. You know what I mean? And Labyrinth is, it's a fairy tale. But the one that's filtered, through kind of a distinctly 80s lens of angst and spectacle and just rock and roll glam. The story centers on Sarah, who played by a young Jennifer Connelly, and we just talked about last week. We talked about another Jennifer Connelly movie. It's a favorite of mine, and in Phenomena. So so here we are talking about her again, and like I said, she plays Sarah, who is this very imaginative, teenager just on the cusp of adulthood. She's frustrated with her life and her distant father and, her demanding stepmother. And she directs all of her kind of adolescent fury onto her baby half brother, Toby. And, in this kind of moment of, theatrical rage, while she's babysitting him, she recites this passage from her favorite fantasy book titled Labyrinth. And she wishes the goblins would come and take this crying baby away. And to her horror, they actually do. So, appearing in this kind of flurry of glitter and dramatic flair is Jareth, who is the Goblin King. Played with this kind of magnetic and predatory charm in a way by the one and only David Bowie. Um, and he is the ruler of this strange world. And he gives Sarah this ultimatum that she has 13 hours to solve his labyrinth and reach his castle beyond the Goblin City just to rescue her brother. And if she fails, then Toby will be turned into a goblin forever. So, what follows this is not merely a journey through a maze, but this kind of descent into a very surreal living world that is both a physical obstacle and this psychological landscape. Um, the labyrinth is a place where up is down, time is fluid, and the rules of logic are just gleefully discarded. It's populated by this unforgettable just cast of Jim Henson's creatures, just each with the kind of a Marvel design and character. And Sarah first encounters Hoggle, who is this grumpy, cowardly dwarf-like creature who ends up becoming her reluctant guide, and whose kind of internal struggle between self-preservation and friendship forms a key emotional arc within the film. And then she later befriends Ludo, who is this very gentle, monolithic beast who can summon rocks. Um, and he's my favorite character in the entire film. And then you got Sir Didymus, who is this very tiny, chivalrous fox terrier knight who rides a sheepdog named Ambrosius. So together, this whole little motley crew, navigates a series of fantastical and just perilous set pieces. The bog of eternal stench is just this kind of a hedge maze full of riddles and false doors. And there's a forest that's inhabited by these wild partying fireys, was what they call them. Who can detach their own heads and throw them around and stuff. And then there's the junk city, which is a kind of a reflection of Sarah's own kind of materialistic childhood. Um, but the true conflict is between Sarah and Jareth. The Goblin King is not a one dimensional villain. He's a tempter, a manipulator. Just a strangely captivating figure. He constantly throws obstacles in Sarah's path, yet seems almost disappointed when she overcomes them. Their relationship culminates in the film's most iconic sequence, which is this a masquerade ball, a dreamlike, illusion where Jareth, is dressed as this tragic romantic hero, and he attempts to, seduce Sarah into forgetting her quest and staying with him in this fantasy world forever. And it's a scene that is dripping with subtext, a representation of this alluring but dangerous, transition into adulthood and desire and just the loss of innocence. And ultimately, Sarah's triumph comes not through physical force, but through that self realization, culminating in that iconic line, you have no power over me. Um, and like I said, the visionary behind all this fantastical tapestry was, of course, the legendary Jim Henson. While the world primarily knew him as that benevolent father of the Muppets, Kermit, Miss Piggy, and the whole gang, Jim Henson was an artist with boundless ambition, and and this is one of the reasons why he is one of the most inspiring people, when it comes to film in my entire life. Jim Henson was an artist with, like I said, that boundless ambition. He saw puppetry not as a medium exclusively for children's comedy, but as a legitimate art form capable of expressing, that full spectrum of human emotion and just telling these epic, sophisticated stories. His first major foray into this territory was with 1982's The Dark Crystal, which is a very breathtakingly ambitious, film that created this entire alien world, and mythology using only puppets. And it was dark and serious and just visually spectacular. But with Labyrinth, Jim Henson sought to combine, the world building of the Dark Crystal with a more human, accessible story. Um, and just inject it with this kind of energy of music and personality. And, he assembled a whole dream team to bring this vision to life. The film's conceptual designer was Brian Froud, whose, kind of distinctive, gnarly, and beautiful fantasy artwork gave the creatures and the world their kind of unforgettable aesthetic. And the screenplay was written by Terry Jones of Monty Python fame, which explains the film's kind of quirky, often illogical, and distinctly, British sense of humor. Um, and as an executive producer, George Lucas lent his kind of fantasy, filmmaking credibility to the project as well. But Jim Henson's direction is what truly unites these elements. His genius was in imbuing his creations with a soul. You believe in Ludo's gentle heart and Hoggle's conflicted loyalty and just that the fiery's chaotic glee because Jim Henson and his team of master puppeteers were just experts, in conveying character through subtle movements. A tilt of the head or the blink of an eye. And in an age now, it's dominated by CGI. Jim Henson's work in Labyrinth really stands as a masterclass in just tangible magic. Um, upon its release, Labyrinth was not the box office success, that Jim Henson had hoped for, and it got this kind of lukewarm reception. It was reportedly really a deep disappointment for him. Um, but like the twist and pass of the Labyrinth's maze, the film found its way to an audience through that long and winding road of home video. On VHS and cable television, Labyrinth was discovered by this whole generation of kids and teenagers who just saw in it something utterly unique. Me being one of them. It just became this kind of quintessential cult classic. And its fan base, was just growing more passionate with each passing year. Its legacy is this multifaceted. First and foremost is the immortal performance of David Bowie as Jareth. It is one of the most iconic roles in fantasy cinema. There's no denying that. David Bowie wasn't just an actor, in a costume. He was the Goblin King. His swagger, his kind of hypnotic gaze, and just and his androgynous glamour really created a villain who was both kind of terrifying and just also really fucking cool. So he he also contributed, 5 original songs to the soundtrack here, including, you know, Magic Dance and the song that they play in the ballroom masquerade scene as the world falls down. And so, Jareth became this kind of pop culture icon, a figure of fantasy and fascination. And for even some people growing up, had this sexual awakening for them. But I won't get into that. But and just this that influence can still be seen, in fashion and music and art to this day. Um, but the film's thematic depth is another reason for its endurance. It's a powerful exploration, of just the painful and confusing and just ultimately empowering transition from childhood to adulthood. Sarah begins the film surrounded by toys and fantasy novels. A child playing at being a grown up. Um, the labyrinth, forces her to shed that theatricality and just take genuine responsibility. The line "It's not fair" is the universal cry, of the adolescent. But by the end, she learns that the world is indeed not fair. And she must rely on her own strength and wit and just the loyalty of her friends to navigate it. And the film teaches that growing up doesn't mean, abandon imagination, but rather learning to control it and not let it control you. And that is why I love this movie so much, because that is just describes me to a T. Because I'm about to turn 39 years old here in a couple weeks, and but I still have that heart of a child. I still embrace all those things from my youth, and it's just I love the nostalgic aspect of it. Um, you know, I'm just always lived by that mentality that just because you get older doesn't mean you have to give up on all the things that you fell in love with as a kid. And that's exactly the story being told in this movie, and I absolutely love that. But Labyrinth is just a testament to the power of practical effects and artistry. In a digital world, the texture of the puppets, the intricate detail, of the sets, and just that sheer physicality of the world that Jim Henson created feels more magical than ever. It is a work of handcrafted wonder, and it is just its influence can be seen in the work of countless artists and filmmakers like Guillermo del Toro, who just champion that beauty of practical monsters and immersive physical worlds. Um, but to watch Labyrinth, is to willingly get lost in this world of just you know, pure imagination. It is a film that is at once, a thrilling fantasy adventure, a quirky musical, just a profound allegory for growing up. For a fan of Jim Henson, it just represents that pinnacle, of his desire to push the boundaries of his art form. And and for a fan of David Bowie, it is a perfect encapsulation of his unique charismatic genius. For me, it's this movie is a portal back to a time of just of wonder, a reminder that the most challenging journeys, are the ones that we take within ourselves. And that, you know, even in these darkest of mazes, the bonds of friendship can definitely light the way, and that holds true in real life as well. Labyrinth is just an immortal classic. A beautiful dream that you never want to wake up from, and just a testament, to two brilliant artists who, in their own ways, truly just had the power to change the world. Um, so, and I was talking about this movie just earlier today with my wife, and you know, she said that she was not always the biggest fan of this movie, but it's also been a very long time since she's seen it. So, um, I'm trying to convince her to watch this again and look at it from my perspective of how I feel about this movie, how strongly I feel about it. And anybody out there that knows my wife that's watching, please talk to her. Help me with this. Help me change her thought process on this, and give Labyrinth another chance. Um, because it just seems like a movie that she would love. Because I know that there's similar things out there. Because you can look at Labyrinth as almost like a Wizard of Oz or Alice in Wonderland type type of film, and definitely like very similar to Wizard of Oz. Um, and it just seems like something right up her alley. But maybe it's just been so long since she's actually watched this. And I know with a lot of stuff, if you watch, especially movies, with me at least, I will not so much care for a movie, when I was younger, but as I get older, with as we get older, our tastes change, and we start to like things more and appreciate things more as we get older. So definitely going to try to get my wife to rewatch Labyrinth and see if her opinion changes on it. And once we do that, I'll let you guys know. But that brings me now to the last movie that I'm going to be talking about for tonight. Um, and this movie was one of the earliest um, influences when it comes to movies on me. So this came out when I was about around 4 years old in the year 1990. And it would be one of the earliest like franchises with, not just these movies, but there's cartoon, toy line, comic books, everything involved within this franchise became one of the biggest things that would, influence me for throughout my entire life, basically, to where I even got my first ever tattoo on my leg is an image from the comic book adaptation of this film. And in that kind of vast and ever expanding universe of comic book adaptations, there are certain films that stand as, monumental pillars, not just for their success, but for their soul, and for fans of a certain generation, particularly those of us who, live and breathe, the lore of the heroes in a half shell. Steve Barron's 1990 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles is more than a pillar. Is the sacred temple, in my opinion. It's a film that just arrived at the perfect cultural moment, armed with these groundbreaking practical effects, a shockingly mature tone, just a profound, understanding of its characters. And it's funny, we just got done talking about Jim Henson and the Labyrinth, because Jim Henson was involved with in his whole like the 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 puppetry studio and everything was all involved in the creation of this movie, with the suits and everything, and while the franchise has seen countless you know iterations across cartoons and comics and all these blockbuster films, none have ever really captured that lightning in a bottle magic of this original this original movie from 1990. For me and for so many others, it just remains that kind of definitive and untouchable, Turtles experience. And to understand why this film is so revered, one must look past all the whole cartoonish premise and just see the that kind of gritty textured world that it builds. The film opens not with our heroes, but with the problem, which is this silent, insidious crime wave sweeping through New York City, orchestrated by this mysterious ninja cult known as the Foot Clan. And we're introduced to this world through the eyes of this intrepid reporter, April O'Neil, played by Judith Hogue. And she's a woman just of integrity, and tenacity, who becomes this target, after exposing, the Foot's reach. And it's in her moment of peril that she is rescued by these shadowy vigilantes, who, to her astonishment, are revealed to be these 4 6-foot mutated talking turtles. And this is where the film immediately distinguishes itself from the popular 1987 cartoon that had preceded it. These are not the goofy you know dimensional hopping jesters of television. These turtles, Leonardo, the burden leader, Donatello, the pensive technician, Michelangelo, who's this carefree party dude, and then Raphael, who's this angst-ridden, soul of the group. They're all a family of these outcasts forged in the sewers, and their introduction is kind of cloaked in shadow and mystique, and their movements are fluid and powerful, and you know they're a brotherhood bound by honor and love, and just the teachings of their rat sensei, Master Splinter. So the plot is really like a masterclass in just character driven storytelling. It's not about saving the world. It's about saving their city, and more importantly, saving their family. And when Splinter is kidnapped by Shredder, who's you know portrayed here not as a bumbling fool like in the cartoon, but a genuinely menacing and just charismatic cult leader. The stakes become deeply personal, and Shredder's Foot Clan is, reimagined as this kind of surrogate family for disillusioned and runaway youth, and which is a kind of a dark mirror to the turtles' own, found family. And this really adds a layer, of social commentary and just emotional complexity that was unheard of, in a kids movie at that time. The film's kind of emotional core is tested during, the iconic apartment fight. It's a very chaotic and brutal sequence that just leaves Raphael near death, and their home is destroyed, and then April's apartment is destroyed, and just the whole subsequent retreat, to April's family farm is really the whole heart of the movie. It's this quiet, contemplative act where the brothers have to heal, their physical and emotional wounds, and they have to confront their fears and just rediscover that, their unity, before returning to face this new nemesis. And just the film's kind of singular aesthetic and kinetic energy can be largely attributed to its director, Steve Barron. Before he did Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Barron was a titan in the world of music videos. Directed some of the most iconic videos of the 1980s, including Aha's "Take on Me" and Michael Jackson's "Billie Jean." This background was just instrumental in shaping the film's visual language. So, Steve Barron, he brought a music video director's sensibility for this dynamic pacing, and striking imagery, and just embedding narrative within stylized visuals. The fight sequences are not just brawls. They're this choreographed, ballets of martial arts, just shot with this kind of energy that makes every punch and kick feel visceral. And however, Steve Barron's greatest decision was his just unwavering commitment to bringing the turtles to life through practical effects. And so, like I said earlier, he enlisted the legendary Jim Henson's Creature Shop, which was then at the absolute peak of its powers. This was a monumental task. The suits were complex creations of foam latex, weighing over 60 pounds each, and just operated by stunt performers, inside, and just a team of puppeteers, and controlling the facial expressions via the animatronics. And the result was just nothing short, of miraculous. The turtles looked real. They breathed, emoted, and just conveyed a depth of feeling that modern CGI often struggles to replicate. The subtle nuances, a flicker of doubt in Leo's eyes, or a frustrated grimace on Raph's face, or um, a joyful grin from Mikey, just kind of gave them all this very tangible soul for each character. It was a groundbreaking achievement in puppetry, and just a testament to Jim Henson's genius. Um, and it just made all the more poignant by the fact that it was one of the last projects that he personally oversaw, before his untimely death, unfortunately. Um, but the legacy of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles in 1990 is immense and just multifaceted. Commercially, it was a phenomenon. It was produced independently by Golden Harvest, for a modest $13.5 million, and it went on to gross over $200 million worldwide. Becoming the highest grossing independent film of all time up to that point. It proved that a comic book property outside of the DC or Marvel could be a kind of box office titan, and it shattered expectations for what a non-studio film could achieve. And culturally, its impact was seismic. The film perfectly captured that tone of the original dark, Mirage comics by Kevin Eastman and Peter Laird, while skillfully blending in, the humor and the catchphrases that made, the cartoon such a huge global hit. And this whole tonal balancing act became a blueprint, for future superhero films, just demonstrating that a property could be both serious and fun. And it appealed to kids and and adults simultaneously. So, it took its subject matter very seriously. It treated, the turtles and like emotional struggles with respect, and just giving its villain, this very terrifying like pride. So Shredder's iconic line, "I'm here to punish you for the death of my master," just delivered, with cold fury, established this level of menace that has just rarely been matched, you know, in the franchise. And more than anything, the film's legacy is defined by its heart. The central theme is family, both the one you're born into and the one you choose. And the bond between the four brothers and their father Splinter is just the unwavering anchor of this story. You know, the campfire scene where they're meditating, they're on the farm where they connect with Splinter's spirit, through that meditation, is just a masterfully quiet and emotionally um, resonant moment that just encapsulates their love and devotion. And this focus on character and theme is why the film endures. While other blockbusters of its era feel dated, by their effects, just the practical magic of Jim Henson's creations and that timeless story of brotherhood have allowed the 1990 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles to age with just remarkable grace. And, in conclusion, in an age that's dominated by CGI spectacle and just sprawling cinematic universes, returning to the 1990 Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles feels like coming home. It's a film that's crafted just with artistry and passion and just an incredible amount of physical effort. It's a dark, funny, and just exciting and just profoundly moving story about four brothers, finding their way in a world that fears and rejects them. You know, it respected its audience, never pandering to the youngest demographic nor shying away from, the darkness inherent, in its premise. It's a testament to just the power of practical effects, and then the importance of character driven storytelling and just that timeless appeal, of a family of martial artist reptiles who just really love pizza. And for this lifelong fan, it is not just the best Ninja Turtles movie ever made. It is a perfect, and I mean this, I absolutely 100% genuinely mean this, it is a perfect piece of cinema. A lightning in a bottle moment that just captured everything that makes this franchise so special. Um, so cowabunga indeed, for sure. And please, please, I don't want to know if anyone has never seen the 1990 Ninja Turtles movie, but if you haven't, good Lord, get on that as soon as you can, because this is one of my most favorite movies ever made. Um, and I feel like everyone should see that at least once before they die. But I guess that is it for tonight, guys. I just want to thank everyone who either watched this live and it was here in the chat. Appreciate Dana stopping by, being in the chat with us tonight. I want to thank everyone if you're watching this on replay, thank you so much for even taking the time to check this out. It means a lot to me, more than you know. Please drop me a comment below on what your favorite of these movies I've talked about tonight, or tell me about one of them that you haven't seen. And once you do go eventually watch it, let me know what you think about it. So if you like this video, definitely give it a thumbs up. I'd really appreciate that. That would mean a lot to me. And if you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button below just to catch more videos from me like this one. Still got a lot coming up for throughout the rest of this year, especially within this month. Like I said, I'm doing all of my different, favorites of different movies and categories and genres and all that through the rest of this month. Got maybe at least one more video within this next coming week. So just more, so stay tuned for that. As always, click that bell for any future notifications. So whenever I go live, you'll get that notification on your phone or whatever, letting you know that I will be live or if I have a new video that I've uploaded. But with all that said, I am Crater. This is CraterMania. I love you guys. Have a good night.